How does a Grammy-winning Nashville songwriter, flying one of the most modern piston airplanes in the world, end up in a fatal crash on a perfectly clear afternoon at a Carolina mountain airport? That's the crazy part of this story. Everything on paper looked ideal. No storms, no technical red flags, and yet the result was tragic. And what makes this case even more gripping is how many unanswered questions it raises about pilot training, Cirrus accident history, the extreme challenges of mountain airports, and what the ADS-B flight data is already telling us. Here's what we know at this early stage. The aircraft was a Cirrus SR-22T, tail number November 218, Victor Bravo, flying from John C. Toone Airport in Nashville over to Macon County Airport in Franklin, North Carolina. On board was Brett James, his wife Melody Carroll Wilson, and her daughter Merrill Maxwell Wilson. Tragically, all three were killed in the accident. The wreckage was found upright in a field about 500 feet north of the runway. There was no fire, which is always striking in a crash like this, but it does line up with what the data shows: a loss of control at low altitude rather than a high-energy impact. And that ADS-B data is really telling. The descent profile shows some aggressive maneuvers, steep descents, circling to lose altitude, and not one but two unstable approaches. The first approach came in too high and fast, forcing a go-around. The second attempt, same story: too short, too fast, and another attempted go-around. But here's the kicker. During that climb-out, the aircraft's speed bled down into the 70s. For a Cirrus SR-22T, that's flirting right on the edge of a stall, and at just a few hundred feet above the ground, there's no margin for error. Weather? Absolutely not a factor. It was clear skies, 10 miles of visibility, light winds, which leaves us with the really frustrating truth. This was almost certainly about pilot decision-making and aircraft handling in a very unforgiving environment. Now, Brett James wasn't just a passenger dabbling in aviation. He was the pilot in command of his own Cirrus. This was a guy who'd conquered Nashville, writing and producing hit songs, and who clearly had the resources to fly a top-of-the-line aircraft like the SR-22T. But here's the part we have to dig into. What do we really know about his flying background? From what's public, he was comfortable flying IFR, using the autopilot, and working out of big towered airports. That makes sense. Most Cirrus owners lean heavily on the avionics and automation, which is exactly what Cirrus training encourages. But the open question is whether Brett had that deeper experience, flying into non-towered airports, threading into a tight mountain valley, and managing unstable approaches without relying on a controller to vector him. And here's something that's not clear yet. Was he formally trained under Cirrus's CSIP program? That program is supposed to hammer in not only how to fly the avionics, but also when and how to use the parachute system. Even more critical in this case, did he ever get actual mountain flying training? Because that's a whole different animal. In places like Franklin, it's not about just punching in an approach on the GPS and letting the autopilot take you there. It's stick and rudder, visual judgment, terrain awareness, and the ability to recognize instantly when a go-around is becoming unsafe. This is why pilot background matters so much here. A Cirrus is an advanced airplane, yes, but when you strip away the glass cockpit, the automation, and the parachute, it's still just a heavy single-engine piston with wings, and you've got to be able to hand fly it precisely when the situation demands it. And I think that's the real tension in this case. How much of Brett James's flying life was spent with automation doing the heavy lifting versus actual hands-on training in high-stress scenarios like this? The Cirrus SR-22T is one of the most popular general aviation aircraft in America. Sleek, modern, packed with avionics, and marketed as one of the safest airplanes in its class. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It also shows up in a lot of high-profile crashes. And if you look closely, the same pattern comes up again and again. Stall spin accidents. Almost always during approach, during a go-around, or right after an unstable approach. Now, Cirrus does have its ace card, the CAPS parachute system. In many cases, it's been a lifesaver. But here's the catch that's extremely frustrating. At low altitude, like right after a botched landing attempt, you don't have the time or the altitude to pull it. That safety net simply isn't available. Which raises a big discussion point in the Cirrus community. Does the parachute give pilots a kind of false confidence? A parachute mindset where you rely on the idea of pulling caps if things get hairy instead of developing the raw stick and rudder skills needed to recover in the moment. In a place like Franklin, with terrain rising around you, there's zero margin for hesitation. Now let's talk about the airport itself, because Macon County is no easy strip. The runway sits at 2,034 feet above sea level, but it's surrounded by ridges that climb up to 5,400 feet. That creates what pilots call a bowl effect. It's intimidating, and it messes with your depth perception. You think you're on the right glide path, but in reality, you're coming in too high, too fast, or too steep. And here's the kicker. The PAPI, those little red and white glide slope lights, were no-tamed out of service on both runway ends. That's a big deal. They're not required, sure, but they're a huge visual aid, especially in a tricky valley airport. Without them, you're left judging by eye against rising terrain, and that's how unstable approaches sneak up on you. There's another factor, too. It was a warm late summer day, 27 degrees Celsius. That means higher density, altitude, thinner air, your engine makes a little less power, your climb rate suffers, and your stall speed edges up slightly. For a turbocharged SR-22T, that doesn't kill performance outright, but combine reduced climb with a tight valley and a poorly executed go-around. You can see how quickly the margins disappear. And this is exactly the kind of challenge flatland pilots underestimate. Flying into mountain airports is a whole different game. Finally, we've got to talk about the maneuver at the center of this crash, the go-around. In theory, it's supposed to be your safety valve, the out if an approach doesn't feel right. But in practice, it's one of the riskiest moves in general aviation. Why? Because you're low, slow, often dirty with flaps, and suddenly demanding full climb performance out of the airplane. If anything is mishandled, power too slow to come in, trim not managed, flaps left in the wrong setting, you're setting yourself up for a stall. Cirrus airplanes, especially the turbo models, can bite here. They're heavier, they've got a slick wing, and they don't forgive sloppy airspeed control. The ADS-B data shows speeds bleeding off into the 80s during that climb out. That's right at stall margin for this airplane. In a valley, with no altitude to recover, it doesn't take much for a stall spin to develop. And this is where the concept of a stabilized approach comes into play. The very first unstable attempt already put the flight on the defensive. Once you're chasing altitude, speed, and alignment in a tight valley airport, you're behind the airplane. By the second approach, the odds of nailing a safe landing had already shrunk. The open questions now are things like, did Brett hesitate? Did he have the flaps and trim set correctly for the go-around? Or was he simply overwhelmed by the terrain and the rapid sequence of decisions? We won't know until the NTSB digs into it, but the data paints a very uneasy picture. So here's where we have to pause. The NTSB hasn't released its preliminary or final report yet, so everything we've looked at today is just early analysis based on ADS-B data and what we know about the airport and the airplane. No firm conclusions yet, but even at this stage, there are real lessons staring us in the face. Training matters, mountain flying proficiency matters, and mastering the go-around, not just on paper, but in practice, really matters. We'll come back to this case once the NTSB has something official to say. For now, it's a sobering reminder of how thin the line can be between a safe landing and disaster, even in a modern aircraft on a clear day.